music next time. I think that'll be a good segue. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Leslie Wright, and I'm the Director of External Engagement at Greater Twin Cities United Way. I'd like to thank you for your time and your commitment to our community and your organizations. Currently, we understand that our communities and we as individuals are hurting. And Akua Ellis, our Senior Vice President of Community Impact, is going to reflect on that shortly. But before we get started, please take note of a few housekeeping items to just be prepared for. This session is going to be recorded, and that is so that we could add to the presentation when it is concluded and uploaded on our website. Please put yourself on mute and turn your video off. We have an awesome registration of about 84 people. So we want to make sure that we keep things as quiet as we possibly can. I wanted to remind us of the purpose of this meeting that occurred right when COVID-19 had started and we couldn't meet individually and in person any longer. And we asked, what are the challenging things that you want to still cover if we could meet virtually? And fundraising strategies, along with a few others, were something that you, our partners, said that you wanted to know about. Please also keep in mind that questions were submitted in advance to the presenters, and they have included the answers to each and every one of them, all 12, throughout the presentation. However, if you have additional questions, please utilize the chat, which will be monitored by Anthony Bass, and he will announce your questions to the panelists at that time. There will also be additional time at the end of the presentation to ask questions. Lastly, please engage and have fun. We're doing this in support of you and your organizations. So I want to go through the agenda that we will be covering today. Next slide. I am doing the welcome right now. We will then go to the acknowledgement by Akua Ellis, and then I will introduce the presenters for today. We will go into the presentation and then questions and answer, and then I will close the session. So again, without further ado, I would like to introduce Akua Ellis.
Thank you, Leslie. Before we get started today, I'd like to thank today's speakers for their willingness to share their insight and experience with us, as well as for their flexibility. I need to also acknowledge Leslie and Anthony for their leadership to not only bring this content to life for you all, our partners, but also for the wisdom to reschedule this conversation, which was scheduled to take place at an earlier date. They also have been intentional about carving out the time and space at the beginning of today's call to acknowledge the moment in which we all find ourselves. So I want to just say thank you, Leslie, for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with the group on our current context. Today's webinar, focused on fundraising strategies, is particularly important given where we find ourselves, navigating the fallout associated with two separate yet interdependent pandemics simultaneously. A moment particularly poignant when we consider the fact that George Floyd died at the hands of police while battling COVID-19. This set of circumstances brings up so many emotions for me as the mother of a Black boy, wife to a Black man, daughter to a Black father, and as a leader, it has me super mindful of the stories that we each tell. For example, I want to read for you an excerpt from how the arrest of George Floyd was characterized by MPD prior to the release of the video footage, which has sparked, rightfully so, tremendous outrage in our communities and across the world. It reads, "Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to the Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. At no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in this incident. Just sit with that for a moment and juxtapose that description of events against the images that you've seen. Narrative matters. Given your respective roles, many of you on the call were very likely the people who either oversaw or directly successfully wrote applications for multi-year operating dollars from Greater Twin Cities United Way. If so, you know that we place an emphasis on asset-based language. We do this for a number of reasons, not the least of which is because the way we define a problem becomes the container for its solution. If, for instance, we name the people we seek to serve as the problem instead of their circumstances as symptoms of injustice, we only reinforce for our stakeholders the mental model that individual choices alone determine one's circumstance, when in many instances, the work of our organizations would tell us otherwise. There is a strong connection between deficit-based framing and paternalistic approaches as well. And that paternalistic approach oftentimes will apply a Band-Aid, but do little to actualize individual gifts and ensure the long-term success for our neighbors in need. But back to our current context. In times like this, it can be confusing to find our role in driving positive change. As fundraisers, you have one of the most powerful tools in the world. You hold relationships to people with resources and can serve as a bridge between our two Americas. Relationships are essential for shifting mental models, and if we view each interaction with a donor as an opportunity to bring them closer to understanding the root of a problem, to see evidence and impact of systemic injustice, we can collectively shift the openness of our entire community toward lasting systemic change. You'll walk away from today's conversation, no doubt, with some really great tactical tools to navigate what is an unpredictable fundraising future for all of us. After all, we've not experienced a moment such as the one that we are in now in our modern history. And I hope that you'll keep top of mind that narrative matters. My heart is heavy, as I'm sure is the case for many, if not all of you on this call. But I'm also hopeful because amazing people like you continue to show up, brokenhearted, yet determined to support change for the betterment of our community. We are not in competition for scarce resources. If nothing else, the last couple of weeks have demonstrated the capacity for our communities to give generously, aligned with a clear call to action and a compelling narrative. Know that Greater Twin Cities United Way stands with you in solidarity, and the conversation today and those to come is evidence of that. Thanks for the opportunity to weigh in.
Thank you so much, Akua, for those words of reflection. Next, we will introduce the presenters. So today we have Michelle Edgerton, who's the founder and principal of the Edgerton Group. We also will have Jeff Halber and Christina Salkowski, who are both directors on our advancement team at Greater Twin Cities United Way. I will ask each of them, and I apologize, Ellie, for doing this to you. I will ask each of them to introduce themselves individually, and then immediately following, they will go into the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Hello, I am Michelle Edgerton, the founder and principal of the Edgerton Group. My firm provides effective and innovative fundraising, communications, and organizational strategies that engage philanthropy. I have had the pleasure of being a professional fundraiser for nearly 20 years and have served in various capacities, here in the Twin Cities, including earlier in my career as a major gifts and plan giving officer, director of events, director of development, and chief advancement officer. I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. In addition to my position at the Edgerton Group, I am currently the president-elect and treasurer for the Minnesota chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. Thank you.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Helber, and I am the Director of Individual Giving at Greater Twin Cities United Way. And before I introduce myself further, I just want to acknowledge and thank each of the nonprofit leaders on this call. Leading a nonprofit in normal times and fundraising in normal times are challenging for sure. But to do so in times of multiple crisis is doubly challenging. And so I hope that everyone finds some of the tools that Michelle and Christina and I hope to share with you helpful, and certainly ask questions. A little bit of background about me. I've been with Greater Twin Cities United Way for 3.5 years. I have the distinct privilege of managing just a phenomenal team of fundraisers, some of whom are on this call, I believe. Prior to that, I spent 10 years as a development officer in higher education, both at the University of St. Thomas and also at my alma mater, Minnesota State Mankato. Prior to that, I had the privilege of running a small nonprofit in Mankato called Open Door Health Center. So I've had that experience and was one of the most challenging 3-year periods of my life. Learned a lot, so I can empathize with many of you on the call. It's where I cut my teeth. I would go to Kiwanis and Lions Club meetings to ask for $500 or $1,000. So I get it. And then before that, I worked in the private sector for about 15 years. So I have a variety of different experiences, and I just look forward to the continued conversation on this call.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christina Selkowski, and I'm the Director of Business Partnerships and Foundations here at Greater Twin Cities United Way. I have been with our organization for 10 years next week, and so very proud of the work that we do. I've seen a lot of, moves in terms of how our organization approaches community and approaches partnerships with nonprofits, and I'm just really thrilled to be here with all of you. I started my career, though, in case management and social work here in the Twin Cities, and got into the development space with the American Cancer Society, which is really where I learned the love of that.
Christine, everyone, could you please put yourself on mute? Could you? Thank you.
And thank you. Really got the opportunity to fall in love with development and fundraising and connecting donors with their areas of passion with the American Cancer Society. And so between case management and social work and my love of development, United Way was really a perfect marriage for me in both of those spaces. I have the opportunity and the joy to lead a fantastic team that really drives towards business partnerships and foundation relationships in the space of how companies want to invest in our work and how they think about their partnership with community and how to make those connections across many different spaces. So very excited for our conversation ahead. And you'll see the questions we received were really based, are really kind of leading where this conversation will go. So these will be the topic points to which we will address. So we wanted to give you visibility into that a little bit. I know there's another slide with a few more kind of questions or topics that were brought up to us, so that if you have something in line with this and we haven't gotten to it yet, know that it's coming. Otherwise, please use the chat box to ask questions. That'll continually be monitored by Anthony Bass. And we will pause kind of through each slide and offer up opportunity for you all to ask questions.
Great. So we'll get started. As Christina mentioned and Leslie, we did receive your questions, and so we're going to really attempt to answer those through this presentation. Many of you want to know, how do we raise money in the middle of a global pandemic? And at that time, when we first started this presentation, the pandemic was COVID-19. And as Akua so brilliantly spoke to earlier, we're now in the middle of another pandemic at the same time. So the principles that are applied here can be applied both for fundraising during COVID-19, as well as the continuous demonstrations and protests that we are currently in as a country, as a world, as a result of the senseless killing of George Floyd. First principle, stay the course for now. Now is not the time for you to reduce or pause your fundraising efforts. We know that organizations who pulled back and stopped asking donors for investments after 9/11 and after the recession or during the recession in 2008, some of them are still recovering from not having that continuous ask. So do not stop, stay your course, avoid any kind of wholesale cancellations of your fundraising plans, adhere to overall strategies and plans with some reasonable adjustments, particularly with the day-to-day work. We know that we're not having in-person meetings now, but a virtual coffee is well appreciated by our donors. Next, double down on stewardship. This is the time to make sure that your donors are hearing from you. You're saying thank you. You're having the phone calls, the virtual meetings, high quality engagement with your donors and with everyone to let them know the true impact of their gift. And this is the time that it's not too much. Thank you goes a long way. And with that thank you, a reference to the impact of the gift. Next, don't stop talking to donors. Don't make assumptions. Don't think that people are just overwhelmed with everything that's going on and therefore they don't want to hear from you. Again, as I said before, organizations who stop talking to their donors after 9/11 and during the recession, there were plenty of other people who were talking to their donors. And now they're still trying to recover from that lack of communication. But make sure that your communication with your donors is information that they really want and need to hear, that they can be fully informed about what's going on, what's the need, what's the impact, how has this pandemic impacted the organization, and how can they as donors partner with you to continue to further the mission. Reaffirm your mission with your donors and the impact. Keep that in front of them. And here I'm going to pause to say that this is really addressing one of the questions that we received about how do you have that balance between fundraising as a transactional job or the relationship building. This is where that continues. It's always about relationship. And it's about essential relationships. So we all have goals and we have fundraising goals that we've tracked for the year, but don't allow those goals to keep you from being in relationship with your donors. The next part of that is acknowledging their fear. Acknowledge that our donors are human beings. They're not ATMs, and we know that. And so ask them how they're doing. Ask them what's going on in their life. How have they been impacted by the pandemic? And then remember our relationship and that it's all about connecting people because they still want to contribute. They still want to have an impact, a positive impact on the organization and on the community. Next slide, please. Review messaging for relevance and clarity. We have to be aware. Do not be tone deaf. And what does this mean? When you're sending letters out to donors or you're communicating with them, you may not want to say things like the infectious spread of love. I mean, because that goes back to the pandemic. People may not be able to receive that as they would have months ago. So just be aware of your messaging, and some of those things that we've just said before may not be appropriate now. So just be really clear about that. Next, buddy up with your CFO. Come on, no one likes surprises, right? The CEO does not want to find out later that you knew now that you were not going to meet a fundraising goal. We need to make sure that we're communicating with them all along, helping with the forecasting for year end, helping inform when may be a better time for certain expenditures that can be postponed. That's our role. And be clear about your projections and make sure that they're based on something other than just a guess. But again, no one likes surprises. Next, have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. And where we are right now really is indicative of that. We could not have imagined in the midst of COVID-19, this pandemic, that we would have what we are dealing with right now with that senseless death of George Floyd, which has another whole pandemic underway. So we've had to pivot, we've had to make some changes. So as you're approaching it, be flexible and recognize that change is inevitable and be ready to move with that change. But make sure you have a plan, a short-term plan that really outlines what your communication intentions are with your donors, with the community. How are you going to keep them informed about what's happening and the impact? And then the messaging may change, just as many of our messages changed 2 weeks ago. So just be flexible and don't rely on just one plan. This is the time to have several backup plans. Next, and this is answering another question that we received about seeing the fatigue with your team and the anxiety. It is care for your people. Share as much information as you can with your team and with your staff, and as frequently as possible. Redouble down on your efforts to help motivate staff. Remind your board, your staff, and everyone of the resiliency of philanthropy. We've been through not this exact same thing before, but we've had other things such as 9/11 and recession. We do have proof that philanthropy is resilient. We will get through this together, but be mindful of what people may be feeling, their anxieties, and let them know that you care. Are there any questions in addition to the ones that we addressed? Okay, we'll go to our next slide.
All right, so thank you, Michelle. You know, what really resonated with me about what you just said is the notion of being flexible, especially in times like this. And we often use the word nimble at United Way, and it really struck me that, you know, we used to talk about communication in terms of having a shelf life. Well, today, there's very little shelf life for a story. And so we just all have to be nimble. And that really leads into the importance of timing. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of short, medium, and long term. Next slide, please, Ellie. So short term, and as we were putting this together, we were thinking in the context of the current crises that we're trying to all manage. And so in that context, we are defining short term as something less than 60 days. That might not work for your organization. If not, define it differently. That's okay. But in that context, what are some things that we might think about in terms of how we build our donor database, build our network and our connection to our donors? And it really starts with knowing who your donors are. Regardless of how small or large your organization is, to me, it starts with knowing who is in your database and querying your database, finding out those donors, and you can sort it a multitude of different ways, right? You could sort by who gives you the most, you could sort by who gives you the most frequently. And each of those queries will give you a different strategy to look at. For example, I would espouse that a donor who gives you a one-time gift of $5,000 5 years ago is not as valuable to your organization as a donor who gives you $100 every year and has done so for 15 years, right? So think about strategies, but they should be informed around knowing who your donors are. We had a question posed about how do you build your or increase your list of supporters? How do you go about doing that? Not sure who the question came from, but I'm going to make a bit of an assumption there that perhaps it might have been someone from a small to medium-sized organization. And in that case, what I would look to do is start with two different avenues there. One is through social media. Social media is a very inexpensive way to get messages out about the work that you're doing. It's cost effective, and it shares your message with a broad group of individuals that may support your work. The other approach that I think might have more immediate impact is start with your board. Lean on your board of directors. If ever there was a time to do so, it's now. It's in a time of crisis. And so start there. Find out what the skill set and talents are of your board. What are their relational connections? Who are they connected to corporately or individually who might have an interest and a passion around the work that your organization does? Secondly, share the impact of your work. I don't know about you, but when I give to my favorite philanthropic organizations, I want to know how my gift is making a difference. And so, rather than writing a simple computer-generated thank you note, take the time to write a handwritten note, if at all possible. Again, lean on some of your board members to assist you if you don't have the staff and internal resources to do that. Ask for donor support. Those of us who are in the development world, we know that the number one reason that a gift is not given is because it wasn't asked for. And we might hesitate in times of crisis, and we might think, it's natural human inclination sometimes to think, gosh, I can't possibly ask John and Jane Doe for their gift. There's so many other interests that they have, but we can't think that way. And if we don't ask, that's the surest way not to get a gift. Most donors respect that we ask for their support, and so I just really want to stress that point. A challenge match donor, what we're talking about there is, and we've seen good success with this. If you have someone close to you, whether it's a current donor or someone on your board who is just incredibly passionate about your work and has been a strong supporter of your organization's mission, ask that donor if he or she might be willing to make a stretch gift, and might you be able to use that as a challenge match to incent other donors. It's just a way to get people to leverage one gift to incent additional gifts. And as Michelle said earlier, you can't thank donors enough. I've been doing this work for about 16 years, and I can tell you I have never had a donor tell me that we thanked them too much. So I can't overstress that. The last point I have here is something I call head, heart. And what I mean by that, and this works well for me personally in the donors that I work with, I try to give the donors I work with 2 data points that lend credibility to the work and the mission of the organization. 2 data points that ground how your organization is moving the dial in the work, and then a heart story. And that's really where you capture the essence and the work that your organization is doing. It really drives to the mission. I kind of say, give them 2 data points, head, and then hit them right in the heart with a compelling story. That could be in a written form. It could be in a short video. And I do acknowledge and understand that sometimes it's hard to go out and seek that heart story from an individual who's being served by your organization. I understand that. But to the extent that you might have an individual who is willing to share their story, it really does motivate and incent donors to consider giving more. It puts a human face on the issue, and particularly in times of crisis. And now I would like to just turn it over to Christina to ask if she has any additions to add on the short term from the corporate and foundation perspective.
Hey, Christina, before you start, we actually had a question from Michelle that popped up, so I want to make sure I get that in there because I don't know how long
Yes,
it's going. So the question was, it says, we are struggling with some of the language in our direct mail solicitation to describe double crisis. Looking to use sensitive language that is justice-based, referring to specifically George Floyd's death.
So I hear that. I mean, holy cow! And what might next week lead us to? I guess what I would stay focused on is the mission of your work. Focus less on the actual crisis and more on the impact that your organization is having in the community, regardless of what the crisis is, whether it's the COVID crisis or the George Floyd crisis. Focus on how your organization is responding to that, hopefully in a very quick manner, but also in meeting people's needs where they are, regardless of what that is. Stay true to your organization's mission and assure the donor that you're there for the short term and the long term.
Also, I'd like to add that as you're talking, as this particular question, when you're talking to your donors about the relationship between the current pandemics, I'm going to refer to them as the current pandemics, and your organization, and that is why you're struggling with double crises or whatever, just relate, how did this death of George Floyd, impact your organization, and just call it out. Sometimes trying to make it short and compact by saying the double crises or things, that's just hard. Just say, I know for one of the organization's cookie card, there was direct impact because of COVID-19, and there was direct impact because of the death of George Floyd. And we called both of them out. And we just said, and it was short, but it was direct, because that's what donors want to know. What's happening to you? How does this relate to the organization's impact because of what's going on around us?
I think that's so important, Michelle. Really, in a word, it comes down to empathizing with the donors and where they might be.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. If that didn't answer your question, please continue to dialogue in the chat box. And it goes to, and really those simplistic kind of language terms that Michelle was referencing, with the corporate audience, they want a clear line between how their dollars are impacting and in partnerships solving to a problem, right? They want to be a part of that glow that comes from the good work that you all are doing, and to kind of attach themselves to solutions and to this hard work that's being done. And so I think that that's the key to that, and how that then gets out doesn't need to be in a big glossy annual report, that we wait an entire year to receive. To Jeff's point earlier, that's done in social media platforms, on Facebook and LinkedIn. Telling those stories ongoing gets to your current donors and begins a conversation with potential new donors. And then when we think about the corporate audience in that space of how do we attract those new donors, we hear about these incredibly large commitments, that we're hearing about. Comcast is giving $100 million around equity and social justice issues. And, Best Buy is committing and Target is committing, all of these very large, very attractive dollar amounts, right? And not that does not, I'm going to tell you, let's go for it, right? But also getting to know your neighbor, your very direct physical neighbor to your organization is really important. And asking them to adopt your organization, to think about, many times a lot of your volunteers are going to have come from companies that are within the same physical vicinity. And so using them as champions inside of their company to encourage giving there. There's some opportunities that we just simply miss sometimes, and with Dollars for Doers, which is a volunteer match, things like that are really important to be able to make sure we're taking advantage of, to say, hey, to our volunteers or to organizations that are giving money, do you guys have a corporate match? Does your company ever match your gifts? So that you can take advantage of some of those things that just sometimes get lost. In terms of, and that particularly comes in helpful, Jeff was mentioning loyal donors. We think of, a lot of times we query when we know we have to do a fundraising push, and we go for who's our biggest donors, and we start there. Those loyal donors, those donors who have been giving for a number of years, are your best audience for kind of a monthly or quarterly giving program. To have them go in and set up an automatic deduction from or charge to their credit card or to their bank account, their EFT, that is consistent dollars. You don't have to stay in this, cycle of asking for gifts. That can then be really stewarding those gifts, and you can start that quickly. And it changes the conversation. It allows you to talk about what the impact is having versus prepping for the next ask. All right. And then the other piece that I just want to note and call out for corporate audiences is the importance of their stakeholders. And that is their board, certainly their employees, their customers, and their competitors, right? And peers in the field. And so what's really key in that is using that social media platform again to get to those audiences, to talk about why Cummins Power Generation is an important partner in community on the 694 corridor. Those are things that are an important story that they can then get out quickly. Is there any questions on that short term, either around individuals or corporate?
There was a question, and I'll just throw it out there because it came up when you were talking, Christina. And Jim, if I get this the wording wrong, please jump in and correct me. But basically, they have a once in a year event based upon the Benevolent model that is planned for September. And I think he's looking for some help because it's a face-to-face event. They're having a transition from face-to-face to virtual, and I think he's asking about the effectiveness of that. And Jim, if I got it wrong, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and re-ask the question.
I will say that we're going to address that a little bit later when we talk about virtual fundraising. I got you, Jim.
Yeah.
Well,
sounds good.
All right, next slide. So we thought it might make some sense to talk about the medium term. And here I would define medium term as 60 to 180 days, more than 60, less than 180 days. And what can be some things that you might consider really focusing on around individual donors in particular. By that point, normally you would hope to have some impact stories. Again, we talked a little bit about that in the short term as well, but really getting some good quality impact stories. And by quality, I'm not necessarily saying that you have to go out and hire a videographer. In fact, what we have seen is, you can record on an iPhone or an Android device and upload that and have that be just as effective as going out and spending a ton of money on a video production or talent. And so we see significant open rates in any emails that we might send to donors when you have those video assets attached to it. They've got to be short, they've got to be succinct, they've got to be aligned to your organization's mission, and they have to demonstrate that there's been an impact and that you've stewarded their dollar, the donor's dollars, in a wise way. Keep donors informed. This is not the time to do less communication, but more, to do more, quite frankly, and to make sure that not every communication with your donors is about asking for money, right? Sometimes you want to just simply share a story and say thank you, and say things like, if not for you, we could not do this work, or because of you, we were able to do X, or we can't do this work without you. Those sorts of statements are really helpful and positive. Again, this bullet was brought up a little bit in the short-term deck too, or slide, but also activate your board and your volunteers. This is the time to get your board members involved and engaged, and as well as your volunteers. If you need volunteers to make thank you calls, if you need volunteers to write thank you notes, if you have someone on your board who is a professional fundraiser, lean on those individuals. This is the time to do that if you haven't already done so. I believe there was a question here around donor fatigue, and there was also a question around donor advised funds. I'll try to speak to both of those. Donor advised funds are a tricky thing, and if you're like what we're seeing, if you're seeing what we're seeing, you're seeing increasing amounts of donors giving through a donor advised fund. And the question that came forward was around, how do you identify someone who gives through a donor advised fund? The short answer is you can't. But what I would say is, if you have the ability to track that in your donor database, do so, because you could learn over time that you might segment your communication to those donors a little differently than you would to another donor. For those that might know about donor advised funds, you know that the donor puts money into a fund as little as $5,000 to start and open a donor advised fund, and they get the immediate tax benefit. On occasion, what we see is that there are actually donors who put money into their donor advised fund and then kind of forget about it. So it's really about how can you tease some of that money out when you need it most. And so just nuancing that is helpful. So again, knowing which donors in your database tend to give through a donor advised fund is helpful. But knowing or trying to ascertain that out in the broader world is really difficult to do. If someone has a donor advised fund with the Minneapolis Foundation or the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations, you're likely not going to know that unless you see it in another nonprofit's annual report or something. It's really going to be difficult to find that. Then show how your organization plans to address going forward. I think that point is important to not only share with the donors what you're doing in the here and now, but what you plan to do in the long term. You want to bring your donors along in that journey. Share with them what you're doing today, but also share with them that we're going to be dealing with this crisis, whether it's the COVID or the George Floyd crisis. We're going to be here for the long term, and we need you for the long term. And our commitment to you is to give you informed, consistent information on a relatively routine basis. That could mean an email every other week. It could mean a newsletter once a month. It could mean a personal phone call by a gift officer or a board member or volunteer once a quarter, just to ask how they're doing. Whatever time frame works for you and the resources you have, But to not communicate with donors at this time is the absolute wrong approach to take. About the question of donor fatigue, it's a great question. And the answer is, I don't know for sure. It's a little too early to tell. I can tell you that the prior to 16 days ago, prior to the George Floyd killing, we were experiencing what appeared to be somewhat of a recovery, and the donors were starting to feel more optimistic. Donors had come forward with great generosity to support our work around COVID-19 and all of those things. Many of you have probably benefited from our WAVE A, B, and or C grant funding thus far. And so we saw a lot of optimism there. And we very intentionally looked for incremental giving, not replacing what we normally would ask for, but above and beyond what we would normally ask for. And the vast majority of our donors stepped up in that way. They saw the need for it. Then the events of May 25th hit, right? And I have to admit, not only internally in our organization did it take the wind out of our sails, as I'm sure it did for many of you on this call, but it also did for many of our donors. And something Michelle said earlier about just having that empathy of your donor, meeting them where they are, acknowledging that our donors are feeling the same thing that we are, right? And so acknowledging that, being there for them. Will there be donor fatigue this fall? I don't know. My prediction is because we live, and this is the optimist in me, it's the glass half full in me. My prediction is because we live in an incredibly generous community with generous corporate and foundation entities as well as individuals, I think we're going to be okay. I really do. But the key there is, don't wait until fall or near the end of the year to ask your donors. Bring them along in the journey now. That is so vital. It's so important. You can't go to your donors once or twice a year with your hand out and not steward and cultivate that donor. Those steps are just vital. And I'll just stop there and ask if there are any questions. Anthony, if any questions have come through related to this.
There are currently no questions in the chat yet.
Great. Christina, what would you add from the corporate and foundation space?
Yeah, I'm going to start kind of where you left off, Jeff, in terms of donor fatigue. And I want to just take a second and say that some people are, we do know that, like this is impacting people differently at all different levels within the overall general understanding is that most donors, and we can look at and compare it to, the Great Recession and all of those things, and kind of looking at some of the things that people are kind of making guesses and estimates on, and they've seen where giving remained flat or for some individuals increased. The only way we're going to know if your donor is exhausted or if it has impacted them in a way that has caused them to not be able to give at the same level is if we have the conversation. So never hesitate to reach out and start, kind of walking through that where their philanthropic desires are at, how they see their ability to give now or in the future. Because if you can be a good partner to them through a very difficult financial time for them, when they do recover, they will remember you, right? And I think that goes to avoiding kind of the emergency solicitations. Now we continue to use words like crisis right now and respond, and all of those things, and being more responsive in that. What we don't want is ever to say, like, to keep my doors open, or we need this. Nobody wants to invest. I mean, this is common sense stuff, but nobody wants to invest in feeling like, a sinking ship or something like that. We want to make investments in a vision forward. Where are you going? And what does that look like? 6 months from now, 9 months, 3 years from now, they want to be excited about the opportunity to invest in something that's going to make a difference, right? And with that comes the opportunity, and this is really sits in that medium term space. Like after you've addressed who are your immediate donors that you need to get to and have a conversation with, then it's about collaboration amongst the group sitting here. What does that opportunity look like to not be in competition for dollars, which is where we kind of started this conversation, but rather complement and strengthen our work, because we know that all of the needs in our community are interconnected. And so how do we bring a bigger solve with maybe even less resources needed because we're complementing one another in that space? And so there's opportunity in that. And then those are some big things. So to that, be realistic, right? we could try to get all, I don't know how many people are on this call, all 80 of us to say, like, what do we want to do, all 80 of us? Be realistic about the number of organizations that can truly make impact, how to communicate those opportunities out to your audiences. And then this is the point in time where you really want to take that immediate conversation and storytelling about your organization and start to really refine it. Start to build that case for the long support, for the overall vision for your organization, because this is going to be different. This is not going to be the same organizations that existed 5 months ago. And so as you think about what does that look like, have an articulate way of explaining that to potential donors so that you can bring them along in that. And then when we'll get into this really more in like the long-term space, but diversifying. And so this is where you want to start thinking about what are those core audiences and donors, and then how do we expand to other revenue. If you have been really an organization that has been based on foundation support, what does that look like when you move to corporate foundations or to individuals? If or any combination of that. So those are pieces where you can even, and we'll talk about what a analysis of your resources looks like, but where doing things like we've heard ideas like where somebody's doing like a little thrift market and things like that at their location now that people can open up, and that can be additional revenue and look different for how the organization is supported. People are doing virtual tours to introduce some organizations and companies to their work, but also as a leadership development or as a training opportunity on community need, and they're charging for it. So just thinking about what other ways in which you can think differently about how you're going to partner. Any questions that came up?
Yes, actually, there was a question directly for Jeff for a comment he made. The question reads, what specific activities do you suggest doing to bring donors along instead of just reaching out twice a year?
Great question. Carrie asked that. That's a fantastic question. I think the best thing to do is to ask your donors. So a question that I've been asking the donors that I work with particularly in the last 3 weeks or 2 to 3 weeks, is how have the events of the past 3 months in general and in the past 2 weeks in particular changed your view of philanthropy? And then I'm just quiet. I wait. And I will tell you that each time I've asked that question, there's this long pause by the donor because they hadn't really thought about it. But then when they do think about it, it's amazing what you get. And you'll get a wide variety of responses to that. There's no one response that resonates, but it begins to inform you about how your donors are feeling. Related to how you bring them along, I would ask them, what about our organization's mission most resonates with you? and then find out what that answer is and learn what that answer is. Well, and then you just have to do some connecting right on the fly, right? Where you have to say, well, did you know that our organization has a volunteer opportunity for X to help Y? And would you be open to considering doing that? Of course, right now it's a little challenging with volunteer opportunities in person. I understand that, but there may be opportunities to help with volunteering. We know anecdotally that donors who are brought in to share a bit of their time and their talent, in addition to their treasure, are much more engaged donors. You deepen the relationship by bringing them closer to your organization. And how to best do that is just ask them, how would you like to spend 2 hours a week or 4 hours a month, whatever it might be, to help our organization? What might that look like? How does that align with your intrinsic value system in wanting to give back? And so that would be how I would approach that question. Any other questions?
There are currently no other questions in the chat.
All right, let's go on to long-term. So here you see the graphic that maybe kind of says it all, but long-term is beyond 180 days. So 6 months down the road and into the future. And we put this here to suggest that try not to put all your eggs in one basket. That may seem obvious. All of you on this call likely know what the mix of your revenue is within your own organizations, right? If you have program fees, if you do event revenue, which we'll get into in a little bit, if you seek grants or are grant funded, corporate and foundation funded, or individually funded by individual donors. But start with knowing what percentage of each of those or any of those your revenue comes from, and begin working with your board and your volunteers to diversify the revenue where you can. I believe that in times like this, the more diverse an organization's revenue is, the more fiscally solid you will be over time. Those organizations that relied solely on event revenue are struggling right now, right? Because we can't have those, $100,000 to $200,000 galas where we raise the bulk of revenue. So that's where it gets to be a bit challenging. So longer term, working to diversify your revenue really is a good strategic thing to be engaging your board with. And I'll just ask Christina to weigh in there from the corporate and foundation side.
Yeah, I'm going to focus a little bit on the foundation and address a question that was asked of our group, really around what should we anticipate, and also how do we kind of prepare for that, right? So again, the best analysts are comparing this to the Great Recession. And the good news in that is that we know that foundation giving really only dropped by about 2% during that time frame. And what I would say is that we are much more sophisticated donors now than we did then. We have much more sophisticated foundation systems who really, instead of working off of their annual holdings, work on an asset averaging. So over the course of where are they for 5 years, and then they're giving away that percentage over where they are in an average. Allows us to be able to plan and to be more thoughtful in those applications and not assume that because they're a foundation budget would not be the same this year as it was last year, that they're not giving away as many dollars. So that's really important. They're having to donate and give away a minimum of that 5%. And so if you're averaging that over the 5 years, that's a really important number for us to be focused on. What I would say that is going to be critical in this, though, is that we all need to ensure that we are stewarding our foundations the same way that we steward any other donor. We need to be in the conversation. We need to be bringing them along through updates on our work and how we are using those dollars and what impact and outputs those investments are having in communities. You're going to get not only kind of the inside scoop then on what you should be applying for, what's coming up, but also opportunities to go outside of a general, RFP. And that is going to be incredibly important as they're thinking about different ways to support community, particularly in COVID and in the killing of George Floyd and the social justice issues that are becoming increasingly more important, or at least the awareness around it has allowed for donors to become more thoughtful in their giving in that space. These can again be done in collaboratives. So I would again encourage in this space to think about whom you can partner with in this room or other nonprofits that can strengthen your bid for those dollars. That's going to be really a key opportunity to take advantage of for all of us. And then don't be afraid to ask your current foundation partners to convert those program dollars into operating. That's an important piece, or some of those dollars that may benefit your organization to continue the good work you're doing. They want to see you succeed and have, keep the doors open and the lights on and all of that stuff, right? So don't be afraid to ask those questions. That happens a lot of the time where they're willing to do that. And then just keeping kind of the ear to the ground around what is going on in that foundation space. Join virtual newsletters, join conversations like this with foundation leaders. Simple and quick things like the Minnesota Council of Foundations, and there's national groups to join and to be watching for, because they're going to help guide opportunities for you.
Hey, Christina, can I just jump in real quick?
Please, Jeff.
One thing that I have been watching very closely on the national stage with family foundations, tend to be larger family foundations, is there's kind of a movement going on now to give a whole lot more significantly this year, more than ever before, but because of both crises. So most of you on this call know that, as Christina mentioned, there is the IRS minimum of 5%. IRS requires that individuals with a family foundation give a minimum of 5%. And over many, many years, that minimum, or floor, as I like to call it, has also become the ceiling. So many of our family foundation donors to Greater Twin Cities United Way, they tend to give out only that 5%. When in actuality, they certainly have the capacity to give so much more. And so there is a play, if you are an organization who knows that you have donors, individual family donors who have a private foundation established. But I would say that strategic play works only when you have a solid relationship with that donor. I don't know that you could do a direct mail approach to those who have private foundations and get any return on that. It works when you have a solid, working, truly relational relationship with that donor, and you leverage that relationship in this crisis to ask them to consider more this year. And I would even argue this is the time to ask for 2 and 3 year pledges. Mm-hmm. You may not be in a robust campaign, but if you're able to ask your annual donors if they are willing to stick with you for 2 or 3 years in a pledge, that is valuable to you as an organization for operating dollars. And I don't know, Christina, would you say that applies also to corporate and large corporate foundations?
Yeah, we had just started moving into that space. We had typically solicited companies and foundations on an annual basis, frankly, and we had started moving into that, had some success last year, and we're quite certain that we would that was going to go by the wayside this year, because companies just wouldn't be able to plan for that and to commit to a 3-year pledge. And we actually this week received a 3-year pledge from Post Foods. And so in that conversation with them, they were like, we want you to be able to count on us. If that means that our nominal gift then stretches even further, then that matters to us, because you can plan for it in 2021, 2022. And so again, that goes to, don't be afraid to ask, right? And to have the conversation, because you're just so certain that there's no possible way, because they surprised us with a wonderful gift.
Well, and just a quick note on the if you don't ask, I assure you, if you don't ask, someone else will.
That's right.
Absolutely. I wanted to join in and say, and with your asking, be specific about your ask. When you're talking to your donors, tell them specifically, would you consider giving this amount or more? And base it on their giving history. Do your research, know capacity and different things. Donors really want to step up and be helpful and be impactful, and they rely on us to help guide them in that. So don't be afraid to ask for a specific amount.
Mm-hmm. Great.
We actually have a question. Let me read it to you. It says, I've heard that family foundations and donor advised funds typically favor white-led traditional institutions, for example, healthcare systems, education, religion, over culturally specific community-based organizations. However, COVID-19 and police violence both disproportionately affect communities of color. For BIPOC-led organizations, how can we break into this sector of philanthropy?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I have absolutely no data to back any of this up. I think everyone on this call would agree that certainly the owners of donor advised funds and family foundations certainly tend to favor white versus BIPOC. But as to how they decide where they want to donate their dollars, I don't have any data to inform that. I think how do you crack that nut, if I understand the question, is again bringing those donors, aligning those donors with your mission. And if the donor is already in your database, if they've already given to you at some point, and we can talk about the recency of giving and the frequency of giving and the longevity of giving, but if they're in your donor database and they do give in one of those three ways, either recently or frequently or generously, the intersection of the three things leads me to believe that there's something about your organization's mission that is intriguing for them, and that you're delivering to them a value proposition and a return on their philanthropic dollar that is important for them. So, because remember, most donors, whether they're giving through a DAF or a family foundation or their checkbook, they want to know their dollars make a difference. They want to do good in the world. And it is our job as professional development folks and to a large extent, the EDs that are on this call do this as well. It is to demonstrate how we can fulfill the donor's need to make a difference through our organization. So I would just start with things like, gosh, Joe, you've been giving to our organization for 8 years, and you've increased your gift each one of those 8 years, and it's remarkable, and it's having a phenomenal impact. What is it about our mission and our vision that most resonates with you? And just dig deeper into why they give to you currently, and that will inform you as to where you might want to take that relationship and their philanthropy going forward. Does that help?
I would also like to add, Jeff, and I know we need to move on to the next section about virtual fundraising, is that this is when you engage and tap into your network. This is why board composition is so important. You need someone who knows you to introduce you to this network.
Right.
And if you are being introduced by someone they know and they trust, That starts the relationship. And then you can further give them information about your mission and the impact. But initial introduction is so important and so key. So look at who sits on your board. Who do you have? Who are your donors? How do you engage and empower and encourage them to introduce your organization to their network?
Yep, exactly.
So I think we're going to move to the next slide now. Okay, we're here now, folks. Virtual fundraising events. I know that there are people on the call who have already jumped into that pool and you've already had your virtual fundraising event. And then others, as the question that was presented a little earlier, are thinking about what are we going to do in the fall if we're still not able to have in-person events. So we're going to address that right now. We're going to start with just 7 steps that any organization should consider and use to convert their fundraising events to virtual. And I'm also going to address the question specifically about the Benavon, or used to be Raising More Money event. First, this is very technical. Choose the format. When you say a virtual fundraising event, what type of event are you wanting? Is this a live stream event where essentially you have your events that you've had before all played out online and it's live? Or is this a fundraising campaign where people, there's a time limited online fundraiser where people can give to your organization? I think most people are talking about the first, which is a live stream event. So just choose which one you specifically want for your organization. Next, this is technical. Choose your platform. There's so many ways that we can do this. Either you're going to do it on Zoom, or is it YouTube Live? Is it Facebook Live, Vimeo, Twitch, whatever. You have to select the platform and make sure that you're comfortable with it. Make sure this is the time to invest in technology so that this is not a hindrance to the success of your event. And then next, step 3, which is really the most important one to me, is planning the event logistics. You're still going to need the same things that you would need for a non-virtual event. What is your budget? What's the timeline? What's the goals, the platform, equipment, website, landing page for registration? How do we ensure that we have covered everything for a successful event? I mean, there's certain things you're not going to need. There may not be a venue now. There's no food. There's no drinks, but then there could be, because you could deliver those things or have people to pick up those things just to be creative in the format of the event. Also, in your planning, this is the time for you to be creative, because I want to talk about another question that was posed about virtual fatigue. We've talked about donor fatigue today, but let's talk about virtual fatigue. And I am sorry to say, I was in a conversation on Monday with a group talking about a fall fundraiser. And one of the members just was very blunt and said, I am tired of virtual. So that answers the question. There is some virtual fatigue that we're already seeing, but we know that the need is still here and the need is still great. And we're going to have to convert some of these events to virtual events. So with that in mind, how do we plan a creative event that is engaging? So things to keep in mind is to keep things fresh as much as possible, to grow and maintain excitement during the event. Follow a script and quickly switch between speakers. Let there not be a lot of downtime. Play pre-recorded videos in between speakers and sessions. Again, this is to keep the participants engaged because it's virtual. Regularly encourage participation via the chat or asking people to go to your fundraising page. Keep your participants engaged. Also think about including a surprise or two as part of your event, such as a guest appearance or a live performance it's going to take place. Also place upbeat music during the downtime, anything to keep people engaged and motivated throughout the event. Next thing is talking about promotion. How are you going to promote this event? Do as you have with your other events. Take advantage of social media and your email, your direct mail, your list, so that you can promote the event and let people know within that promotion exactly what is going to take place. You can let them know that there are going to be some surprises, but let the way by which they're able to give not be a surprise. What do I mean by that? Make sure that you are clear with people about how they can donate during this event, before the event, and even after the event. Make sure you have that all settled and set up, and that you have a platform that's going to work. Next slide, please. Rehearse. You know, even for in-person events, I believe in a full run of show and rehearsal, and definitely for a virtual event. There's always opportunities for there to be some hiccups and for things to not quite cue in as you expected, particularly with technology. Is the video going to actually play when we wanted it to play? So make sure that you rehearse and go through every component of the event so that you're ready when we get to step 6, which is go live. And now, you know what? This is your moment. Own it. You've planned, you've rehearsed, you've done everything. Live in that moment and recognize there are going to be some mistakes. Be ready, be flexible, be nimble, be able to cover those mistakes as much as you can. But it's live now, and you're just going to have to flow with it and have fun. Next, follow up. Give donors another opportunity to give. So follow up, see if they enjoyed the event, thank them for their participation, and then invite them to give again if they like. I see the chat room is lighting up, so we're going to address some of those questions, but not before I go specifically to the Benavon model. So this is my advice with that particular fundraising model. And I've been doing this event since it was called Raising More Money. You are correct. This is an event that's built on personal relationships and engagement and interactions. It's also based on having that heartful ask and people getting emotionally involved and engaged in the event. We're going to have to be creative, folks. Consider asking table hosts if we're unable in the fall to gather, which it looks like we may be. I'm not quite sure. I was also talking to a hotel downtown, and they said that they're going to be able to have events in the fall at half capacity unless something changes. But in case we're not, then consider part of your event being live and in person to adhere to whatever the guidelines are about capacity. But then talk to your table host. See if they're willing to have this event and intimate in their homes. I mean, ultimately, the table hosts invite people to join them at their table and participate. So ask them if they're willing to have that in their home, and then have them connected to the live event as well. You're going to have to also have your stories. It's always wonderful to share your stories. That's the emotional piece, but also that's the impactful piece. Make sure that your stories include the impact of the mission and the organization. I won't say that a Benavon model type event cannot be successful, because I believe that it can be. We just need to be creative in our approach. I'm going to yield now for questions. I know we have some, Anthony.
Well, actually, there's an ongoing conversation regarding some of the earlier points, but no, there aren't any direct questions regarding anything right now.
Okay, well, wonderful then. So that time is winding up. So that, in a nutshell, is really how you convert your in-person live event to a virtual fundraising event. I want to reiterate that this is not the time to not invest in the technology. We have all been on Zoom calls, or we've been in meetings where someone's mic is not working, or there's a problem with the Wi-Fi. So you want to be sure that if you're going to separate people out into various rooms during your event as part of that virtual experience, that you know exactly what you're doing, you've rehearsed it, and you're able to bring them back together as needed. And have fun. Thank you. So this next slide shows all of our contact information again. Again, I'm Michelle Edgerton, and I am honored to be joined with Jeff and Christina today. If you need to call us, please do so, and we have our email addresses on this slide as well. We would love to answer your questions as you think of things as this presentation ends. This is also a slide that we put together just to answer one of the questions about other fundraising resources. Feel free, I see Christina just popped back in. Christina, you want to address this as well?
This is really meant, and because you're going to get the slide after, but just as some of the resources that are available to you out there. This is certainly not a comprehensive list, not even close. I'm sure some of you have some resources that you could share with the group too, that have been helpful to you, but these are some good places to start if you're looking for additional support, as well as using our contact information above. Conversations help to spark ideas for us as well. So we invite those in. And you can go to the next slide, Ellie. And then this slide is really meant as kind of a first step for everybody when they leave here, which is to take an inventory of your resources. So you do kind of start there, which is really your reputation, and to think of that as a resource. You know, what makes you different than other organizations, and you know, your mission, your values, your impact, the importance that you have in the community, certainly reflecting on the people, your staff, which is, you know, Michelle started there with a lot of her comments around the importance of valuing and retaining staff, and that is so critical, especially in the fundraising space, because it's relationship based. Your board and how to leverage and use them, your volunteers and advocates, champions in the community, and then certainly your donors and how to steward them. But you've got to know who you're talking to first and what those audiences are, and also see what you have at your fingertips to be able to create new plans, diversify income, things like that. Think about your infrastructure. Do you have an event that has been a longstanding community event that you could shift to being a virtual event, or a more of a pledge, or, you know, kind of a appeal? There is some opportunities there, particularly as we talk about going from a one-time donor to an ongoing donor, to say, this is actually how we're going to shift this year. You guys have consistently bought a table, or whatever that looks like, and we'd like to be able to count on these kinds of gifts throughout the course of the year for our planning. And then material holdings. What kind of technology do you have at your fingertips? Your building is a resource that can be used differently, that you can rent space out in, or sell, or, you know, whatever those things are. Think about things you have that are just collecting dust in a storage room somewhere. There's all kinds of things, right? So taking a step back, think about what you've got, and then start the planning from that point forward. Any questions on resources, or any questions on the full presentation? Because we're at the end, y'all. Like, this is it.
There are currently no questions in the chat.
Okay. It's a lot. We know it. But we appreciate that you guys are going to be out there sharing your mission and working really hard over these next months, and really, you know, years, as we launch into kind of a new space in philanthropy, to gain donors in that space to support community. So thank you all very, very much for being here and being our partners in this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. As we come to a close, I just want to make sure that I give the appropriate thanks to putting on an event such as this. So thank you to the panelists, to Christina and Jeff, and to Michelle, who put a lot of time and effort into this, and really, really said, we want the presentation to be information on what people want to hear. So please get us those questions. And thank you to you all who submitted questions and gave good recommendations on what we needed to follow. Thank you to the staff. Without them, I don't know what I would do, that helped me, that put this presentation together, and that drove it so that it could be a success for you. I don't want you to forget our next session is on Thursday, June 25th. And originally, when we put this together, it was going to be on the road to recovery, which it still is, but we thought we would be back to normal at this point, and things aren't quite normal, but we're still going to have a robust conversation around what it's going to be like next. And stay tuned for more information about registering for that session. And also, we ask for questions and information that you want to cover to be sent to us in advance so it could be already incorporated into the session. Today's information is going to be included in our newsletter that we send out next week, as well as on our website, as with all of the others. And given the times that we're in and United Way's commitment on equity, I thought that I would end today by just reading a commitment to live inclusively that I have received from the Winters Group in a session that I did. And when we conclude, that would be the end of the session. So this is entitled A Commitment to Live Inclusively. I commit to be intentional in living inclusively. I commit to spending more time getting to know myself and understanding my culture. It is in understanding myself that I am better positioned to understand others. I will acknowledge that I don't know what I don't know, but I will not use what is unconscious as an excuse. I will be intentional in exposing myself to difference. If I don't know, I will ask. If I am asked, I will assume positive intent. Most importantly, I will accept my responsibility in increasing my own knowledge and understanding. I commit to speaking up and speaking out, even when I am not directly impacted, for there is no such thing as neutrality in the quest for equity, justice, and inclusion. I will strive to accept and not just tolerate, respect, even if I don't agree, and be curious, not judgmental. I commit to pausing and listening. I will be empathetic to the experiences and perspectives of my others. I will use my privilege positively and get comfortable with my own discomfort. I commit to knowing, getting, and doing better than I did yesterday. Keeping in mind my commitment to live inclusively is a journey, not a destination. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.